It's so hard as a leader, as a CEO, as a founder to say no because you've hired all these people and they're so excited about doing their thing. That's why you hired them. They're so invested and they all start telling you, well, we've got $10 million in the bank. We've got $20 million in the bank. So now I want to do these marketing campaigns and I've got this great idea about developing this AI technology and I want to hire 20 more people. It's very hard just to say, no, I've got the money in the bank, but I'm not going to spend it on you, but somehow grow fast.
You're listening to the Startup Podcast. This is an educational episode, in-depth masterclasses about the concepts essential to building, running, and investing in Silicon Valley-style startups. Whether you're a founder, investor, or operator in a startup, you'll gain insights into the principles that power high-growth disruption the same way Facebook, Google, and Uber do it. The conversation starts now.
Hi, I'm Yaniv Bernstein.
I'm Chris Saad.
And I'm Mona Sabet.
Welcome to another episode of the Startup Podcast. On today's show, we're going to talk about the common mistakes that founders make at each stage of their startup. We're going to talk about the launch wave, the pivot wave, the scale wave, and we're going to tease a little bit about the M&A and exit wave. And to do that, we have an awesome guest called Mona, who is a veteran of Silicon Valley and written an incredible book about it. We're going to talk about all of that and much, much more on this week's show right after the break.
Whether you're starting or scaling your company's security program, demonstrating top-notch security practices and establishing trust is more important than ever. Vanta automates compliance for SOC 2, ISO 27001, and more, saving you time and money while helping you build customer trust. Plus, you can streamline security reviews by automating questionnaires and demonstrating your security posture with a customer-facing trust center, all powered by Vanta AI. And it gets even better. Just for TSP listeners, you can get $1,000 off Vanta when you go to vanta.com/TSP. That's VANTA.com/TSP for the Startup Podcast to get $1,000 off. Welcome back. Now, just before we jump in, I need to remind you all about the Startup Podcast Pact. This podcast is free, but we only ask one thing in return for all the content that we're putting out there for you, and that is that you help us reach more people by following, rating, and reviewing us on your favorite listening app and on YouTube, and giving us a shout out wherever it is you have an audience of fellow founders. Now on with the show. As a founder, you're going to make a lot of mistakes. Many of these mistakes are inevitable. They are part of the startup experience. But there is also a category of unforced errors, mistakes that founders make that could easily have been avoided. These mistakes are often the ones that kill a startup. So today, we are going to talk about some of the top unforced errors that founders make at every stage of the startup journey. And joining us to discuss this, we have an incredible guest. Mona Sabet has over 25 years of experience in Silicon Valley as a tech executive, advisor, board member, and advocate for female leadership in tech and beyond. Her CV is too accomplished to distill into a punchy intro, but a couple of notable achievements include taking user testing to a $1 billion+ acquisition as their chief corporate strategy officer, and founding High Power, a network of women shaping the future of tech. Mona has recently published a book called Sail to Scale, Steering Startups Clear of Mistakes from Launch to Exit, that really takes all her decades of startup experience and distills it into a pithy, readable book. It breaks my heart to see founders make unforced errors, so when I read Mona's book, I knew we had to have her on the show. Mona, welcome to the Startup Podcast.
Pleasure to be here, Yaniv. Thanks for introducing me and inviting me.
Pleasure to have you on. So we'll jump into the mistakes really very soon, but tell us a little bit about what drove you to write this book in the first place.
Well, as you mentioned in your kind intro, I've got a few years of experience under my belt, and I saw businesses making these same critical mistakes over and over again as they tried to grow and scale. And it didn't matter. What's interesting is it didn't matter whether they were software companies, hardware companies, services, businesses. Even lately, I've been in the manufacturing space. They all seem to still have common mistakes, regardless of what segment you're in. So I knew my co-authors, Maria and Heather, a long time before we decided to write this book. And it was really the fact that two of us, Heather and I, both had exits of our companies. They were both acquired, that led us to get together and think about the journey that we've been on. Maria had worked for a couple of very big tech companies, the products you probably use every day, maybe every hour. And in talking, it was surprising to us how each of us kept running into these common mistakes that we had to solve for over and over again. What struck me in particular is that the stories we hear in the business news they're hardly ever about mistakes. I really appreciate your podcast because you focus on mistakes a lot. And I do think we learn oftentimes from our own mistakes. But, the business news always talks about the extremes. We either celebrate the supposed instant successes. We know they're not instant, but they talk about them as if they are, or we vilify retrospectively obvious complete flameouts. The dominant narrative in the tech media is all about insert big CEO name here and how they grew a startup big and fast. And let me tell you how they did it, right? But it's not terribly useful for 99% of the startups who aren't in that one top corner case. And so we set about writing a book from a different point of view, essentially.
Yeah, that's really great. And as you know, Mona, living in Silicon Valley, the culture here celebrates mistakes, failures, failed companies. And it's often true that a VC, an angel investor, will back a second or third time failed founder before they'll back a first time founder that hasn't failed yet. But as you said, Yaniv, and as we talked about before we started recording, there are mistakes that are worth making, not necessarily mistakes, but trying something, an experiment, and seeing it fail is part of the process. It's not that failure is okay, it's failure is part of the process. It is essential to your success. But there are failures, there are mistakes you just don't need to make. And you can benefit from other people's hindsight, other people's lessons. And you can do that by reading amazing books, listening to amazing podcasts, having amazing advisors and mentors. And hopefully this episode will be a great distillation of some of these mistakes and these failures. You just don't need to make them. So we'll cover quite a few here and we'll bucket them by phase. We can talk about your waves here to structure the rest of the podcast.
Yeah, and we like calling them waves because they tend to come at you and they can either crush you or it could be an exhilarating ride, right? Depending on how you approach each wave in your startup journey. And I would also say, Chris, that you're right. There are mistakes you can make, they're failures, but you can mitigate them, I think. And that's really what we were trying to achieve with the book is you're still probably going to make them, but maybe you will learn a little bit about how to avoid them or recognize them early and then pivot along the way rather than have them crush your boat as you're trying to sail.
I think one of the things that's interesting, Mona, is when we're sort of making this distinction nearly between the necessary mistakes, the forced errors and the unforced errors is another thing we like to say quite often is know the game that you're playing, right? So I think often a lot of the mistakes that you've mentioned in the book and that we'll talk about soon are mistakes of not understanding the rules of the game that you're playing. And I think there is the startup game in general. And then to your point, there is the stage of the startup that you're in or the wave that you're in. And quite often what happens is if you don't understand the rules of the game at the stage that you're at, you will be playing by the wrong rules. And, I think that's a category where a lot of these mistakes come in. And so, I'd love to get your thoughts on this, obviously, but my interpretation of the book is the first thing you need to know is what are these different waves? What are these different stages? And secondarily, I think to me, it's really interesting to ask the question, how do you know which wave is coming at you? How do you know what stage that you're in?
Yeah, I think that that's a really good point. You have to start by knowing where you are. And, since I've written this book, I've spent a lot of time talking to startups about exactly that. You think that you're already ahead of the launch wave, but you're not yet. So maybe this will be my second book. But it's very much about understanding that what you're doing in the launch wave, the first wave of the first journey on your book is very different from what you're doing, let's say, as you're scaling a company and trying to act in a way that is scale when you're in launch is going to kill you, act in a way that is launch when you're in scale is also going to, maybe not kill you, but really slow you down, not be able to scale the company. So we broke down the journey of a company into 4 what we'll call waves. The last one, exit, is got a little bit of its own, personality. But when you think about startup, you're often thinking about launching. Most stories and most discussions are all around this wave. But, I've been in startups that are in the, Silicon Valley vernacular, we call them scale-ups. They're farther along than startups. And so there is a scale wave, and it is very different from a launch wave, even though we still call them startups oftentimes. Any time during this period, you might pivot. And so we talk about pivoting immediately after a launch when your launch doesn't succeed. But there are pivots right along your journey. And then the last wave we talk about is the exit wave. And I think the exit wave is interesting because it comes at you if you're not preparing to exit right from the very beginning. And this is a perspective that I have that I think is very counterintuitive to what Silicon Valley often tells you to do, which is don't think about exit, just think about growing and scaling and getting faster and faster. And I have a very, very strong opinion that if you're not creating an exit strategy early on in your startup life cycle, then you're not going to set yourself up in case you need to have a successful exit at some point in the future instead of being a standalone IPO company forever.
Yeah, so maybe just to put a button on that, this question of mistakes and failures that are worth making, and then mistakes and failures that are not worth making. It feels like to me there's like maybe roughly 3 categories here. There's kind of mistakes of not knowing the game you're playing, which business models make sense, what structures make sense. There's mistakes of not knowing the kind of people to work with and the structures and the fundraising process and that sort of thing. And then there are mistakes and failures in terms of trying to learn and understand your product, your market, and achieving product market fit. And so those first 2 categories, those are actually really well-worn, almost cookie cutter things that you can learn from others who've understood the Silicon Valley game before. And that third category, there's lots of mistakes, lots of failures, lots of learning to do about that particular product and business. And so in many ways, the Silicon Valley process is very cookie cutter. It's very much a production line. There's like, pre-seed and seed and Series A and Series B and Series C, and the amounts and the proportions and the way you do that. There's innovation in terms of how they arrived at that, but then there's a fairly well-worn pathway to execute that game. Where the innovation occurs is in the software, in the product, in the disruption.
Yeah, I think, Chris, Silicon Valley has a lot of deep understanding that has turned into very, what I'd call reductive statements. So we all know you have to find product market fit, but it's become really hard to define product market fit for someone. You all know that we're going from Series A to Series B, but we don't really understand how that connects with where you are along the startup journey and which wave you're in. You could be in Series B and still be in the launch wave. You can be in Series A and already be in the scale wave, right? So when are you ready? When are you out of launch? What does it really mean to find product market fit? What does it really mean to have an MVP that's working out in the market, right? Because only when that happens are you ready to start investing and scaling. Founders tend to try and scale too early because they don't realize that they're still in this launch wave.
Let's talk about the launch wave. So obviously this is the first wave where you are really starting up your startup, right? And you've identified a number of mistakes that are very common at that wave, at that stage. I thought we could dive in on a couple of them that you see as particularly common or particularly pernicious. And the first one that we thought we would talk about is being in love with the solution and not the problem. So tell me what you see here and why it's so problematic.
Yeah, it definitely is one of the most interesting mistakes we identified that are common. So most people want to start a company and then they look for something that they can build that they think people will buy, especially in Silicon Valley. Everybody wants to be an entrepreneur, right? And so everybody's looking to, I think I can build this. I wonder if people will buy it. And this is particularly true for technical founders. Technical founders know a particular technology well and then are often very creative about the applications that that technology can fulfill, right? But that's really backwards thinking in my experience. Startups with the highest chance of success are the ones where the founder has first personally experienced a really painful problem in a particular industry that they've been close to, and then starts looking for a solution to that problem. It's very different from I've got a technology and then I want to find an application for it. That first solution is not often the right one. We all know that. You have to pivot, you have to fail a few times, right, in order to be able to get through to product market fit. And if you start with what you want to build, which is the solution, you're going to be very attached to it and less likely to be open enough to throwing away that solution in order to fix the problem that is actually out there in the industry. I've got 2 examples. One company, this is a story that didn't make it into the book. It was founded by a professor and their PhD student. It was based on some patented research that they developed. Super deep tech, certainly had many applications. I got involved. They asked me to advise them. And they even received, this was maybe 8 years ago, received funding from a brand name VC, literally had 3 slides and nothing yet, very proverbial business plan on the back of a napkin type Silicon Valley story, right? But no one in the company had come from the industry that they were targeting. They didn't actually experience the problems themselves, so they didn't actually know how painful it was, or if their particular patented technology that they'd been working at the university for so long was the right solution. Fast forward 8 years later, they've pivoted a few times. They've switched their investor base. They're still going, but it's been a long time, and I think they're still trying to find that product market fit. They're still in the launch phase that much later. And you can contrast that to the story that I have of user testing in the book, where the founders actually started a completely different company. And during the process of launching that company, they realized how hard it was to get real user feedback from people that weren't just their friends and their family in an efficient manner. And it felt like such a pain for them because they were trying to get that feedback in order to launch this other company. And they weren't able to do it. They built a solution to do it and realized that that was a more interesting solution for the market than their original plan. And so they switched. 14 years later, user testing became one of that less than 1% of startups that end up going public.
Yeah, of course, my favorite example child from many episodes is Uber, right? When Uber started, they were offering black cars to rich kids in San Francisco. And that was the original idea, actually, in Paris, and that was the original product and solution. But if they had fallen in love with that product and that solution, they wouldn't have been able to identify their MVP properly, and founders struggle with that because of falling in love with their idea. And they wouldn't have been able to evolve their product and business as new data emerged. So what they did instead is they fell in love with the problem, which is we need to get people from A to B. It's not we want black cars with a press a button, get a black car. And so if the problem is reframed as getting from A to B, you have in your mind likely a Ferrari, but it gives you the freedom to imagine a scooter as your MVP, because a scooter also gets you from A to B, but it's easier to build and it's cheaper, faster, better to get to market and then iterate your way towards a Ferrari. It also allowed Uber, and would allow you, to iterate as conditions change. So they started with a black car, but then they realized a lot of people can't afford black cars. So they need to be able to slide down market. And their competitor at the time, Zim Rides, which later became Lyft, introduced peer-to-peer ride share. So if they were in love with black cars, or they couldn't have adapted to the changing business model, and then now robo-taxis are coming out. And so that too is part of the problem, which is getting people from A to B, and they can pivot to that as well. And so you can see by holding onto that problem, we want to get people from A to B, it allows you to more easily identify a much simpler MVP to start with as a wedge in the world. And it allows you to also adjust, pivot, go down market, think of alternative solutions, and in some cases, disrupt your own idea for disruption with a simpler, better, faster, cheaper product, solution, technology idea.
I just wanted to sort of challenge this a bit and maybe nearly extend it. And I'd love your take on this, Mona. So I agree that falling in love with a solution is bad. But what I've started to realize, and when we talk about pivoting, I think this becomes more obvious, is that sometimes falling in love with a specific problem can have some of the same problematic characteristics. And you mentioned user testing. I think a really classic example is Slack, which famously, is one of the most famous examples of an epic pivot, where they went from being a gaming company to a corporate messaging company. In that case, if they had stayed in love with the problem, which is, people are bored and want to play a game, then they never would have built Slack, right? They never would have identified that opportunity that came in front of them. So I nearly wonder if, when I think about this, what we really want to see as founders, if we want to succeed with our startup, is to fall in love with the idea of solving problems in general, right? We start with a problem that is a hypothesis. We try to solve that one. But if a better problem comes along, then that's part of pivoting, right? Then we jump onto that problem instead. And being stuck on a problem just because it's a problem that I care about, what I might learn is actually it's less of a problem for the world than I thought it was. And I should be solving a different problem. So what are your thoughts on that?
Almost a perfect intro into the second wave, which is the pivot wave, right? How do you know when you're ready, when you need to pivot? I would maybe take what you said and break it down into 2 parts, as I said, the launch wave or the pivot wave. You do need, when you're launching, to fall in love with a problem, not with a solution, because it's very hard as humans when you've got your own solution to let go of it, right? you've already sort of been very attached. We're very attached to what we believe we have created for the world. It's our baby. But you're right. You might find that after you've, and I love the word that you used, hypothesis. We use that a lot in the first section of the book, because the entire launch wave is hypothesis testing. And if you're not hypothesis testing, if you're sending stuff out there and you're not testing a hypothesis you've stated in advance, you're wasting a lot of time. This is all about testing to see if the problem you're solving has enough of a market that will pay enough money for you to create a business that can grow. And it might be that even though you're in love with a problem, you still don't have a business. And, that is true. In which case, I would then say, yes, you have to fall in love with another problem. I would hesitate about falling in love with a problem and then falling in love with another one and another one, because we talk about focus a lot. And if you can't focus on one problem for a period of time to fully test the hypothesis, then you might just be switching too often, perhaps.
There are these fundamental beliefs or religions or cultural tenets that are true, from the Valley and have now spread around the world that underlie a lot of these behaviors. And this feels to me like it's related to strong opinions loosely held. So you might have a strong opinion about a problem, but you want to hold it loosely enough that you might decide, actually, that's not a real problem, or what I imagined isn't true. And you want to have a strong opinion about a possible solution to that problem, but you want to hold that loosely enough that you can learn and pivot and adapt as conditions change. Another fundamental thing here, and I want to challenge one of the things you just said there, Mona. I see a lot of founders who are looking for a problem and a solution that is important enough that people will adopt, and then you said will pay a lot of money for. And I just want to caution that they need to be able to do that in the fullness of time. Your MVP is rarely something that a lot of people are going to adopt and they're going to pay a lot of money for. There's a small little landmine here, which is remember that your MVP is just looking for a glimmer. It's just the wedge in the world for some group of people who will just change their behavior toward your product. And they may not actually be willing to pay a lot of money for it at all, but you're looking for that glimmer that over time, through good iteration and additional features and additional value creation, that more and more people will pivot their behavior, and then more and more people will pay you more and more money over time. I just want to put that little caveat in there because I have seen people launch something and go, oh, people don't want to pay us how much we need to make, and therefore we're going to pivot to something else. And I'm like, no, of course they're not. This is the first version of your thing. You got to keep going. You got to keep adding some features and make it more valuable.
Chris, I'm actually going to ask you a question. So I have a very different definition of MVP versus product market fit. Do you see those as being different? I totally agree with what you said, and I think that is absolutely true for a minimum viable product. I see product market fit as being one stage later than, or maybe 2 stages later than launching a minimum viable product.
So I hate the term minimum viable product. I just hate it because it suggests that there's some end state where you've decided what is minimal, what is viable, and what is a product. And in my estimation, in my experience, the reality is that you are trying to develop a series of minimum viable iterations that attract a minimum viable set of users who will change their behavior in a minimum viable way. And over time, you are making it less minimal, more viable, and more product. And so your initial version may attract only a very small group of people who are diehards, and they may pay you nothing. But that initial change of behavior, that initial inkling, again, imagine a scooter, may eventually turn into an electric scooter. So now it can help people who want to go 1 block and want to go 10 blocks. And it may turn into a gas-powered scooter. Now it can help people go 1 block to 20 blocks. And then it might eventually turn into a motorbike. So you can now go 1 block or a whole neighborhood, right? And so over time, your product becomes more relevant to more use cases for more people with deeper pockets who are willing to pay more money for it. And so it is a journey, but at each step along that journey, you're looking for that pull, that what we call product market fit, that enthusiasm for that, sometimes that very embarrassingly narrow set of people for that embarrassingly narrow problem.
And it is, it's easy for me to describe it as, and now you're done with one wave and you're ready to go to the next. But it is sort of a continuous journey, right? It's not exactly one stage begins and the next stage ends. But I like separating the two. I think people conflate the two. A minimum viable product is all about hypothesis testing. And you could have a full product out in the market and still have another new minimum viable feature that you're going to add on to it. And so it's continuous hypothesis testing, even if you're full on scale up and you're making a lot of money, but you're adding that next little thing onto it. Product market fit, I believe, is when you actually are starting to get that money, the beginning of money to show that you can do something repeatable efficiently. And that's beyond MVP. So I think I'm agreeing with you.
So, I mean, I think this is a good segue to the next mistake in the launch wave that we wanted to talk about, Mona, which is building the wrong MVP. And, as Chris said, I think the term MVP is problematic because it means different things to different people. But tell us a little bit about when you say that building the wrong MVP is a common mistake. What are you seeing there?
I have two big things. One I've already talked about, which is we're not really testing a hypothesis. You're throwing something out there without testing a hypothesis, and you're wasting time if you're doing that. I have written a fair bit about people have confused the V in MVP. They think it's now minimum version rather than minimum viable. And so, you have to put something out there that actually solves a problem still. Even if it's that small, narrow problem, it has to solve a problem. And I think we've just moved too quickly in the Silicon Valley zeitgeist of saying, no, just throw anything out there. And that's just a version, but it might not be a viable version. So if I'm trying something and it doesn't actually do enough to solve my problem, then it's just a minimum version product, but it's not really a minimum viable product. You can't test anything because if I'm not using it, you don't know why. It could be because it's not full featured enough. It could be because you're not solving my problem. It could be because it's too hard to use. It could be many things. You just have no idea why. And so, the biggest mistake I see founders make, I'm actually working with a founder right now, and I'm a second-time founder, Chris, also, and, easily funded, but similar mistakes still, in that we're not testing for anything at this point. It's like, oh, I've got a bunch of technology. I think it could be used for various things. Try it. Tell me what you want to use it for. It's just too minimum.
Let's stay on that V again, Mona, because I think you make a point that, sometimes people just see it as, I call it the crappy V1, that's the MVP. But I think the other thing that happens is even if they understand that it's about viability, the question becomes viable for what, right? And exactly to your point that, it is a minimum viable for testing a hypothesis. If you don't have a hypothesis, there is no viability there, right? And I think in the absence of that, people think, oh, it's a minimum viable product for building a business off. It's a minimum useful product or something. And they get very confused. And that's where it becomes a sort of bloated V1. And then when they realize it's taking too long, right? Which is if you treat the MVP as just the first version of your product, if it's taking too long, then you start to cut quality rather than focusing more, right? And that's where you sort of peanut butter it and it's not useful for anyone.
Two things that you just touched on there, Mona. The first is you're talking about a second-time founder, successful founder. It's worth emphasizing again, most founders make these mistakes, even second and third time experienced founders, because as Yaniv once said, and I've stolen this quote, you can't read the label from inside the bottle. So once you're in the startup, you lose track of, to mix another metaphor, the forest for the trees, and it's very easy to fall into these mistakes. They're just really easy to make, which is why coaches, advisors, mentors are always very valuable to come bring you along on the journey. And the second thing is, this question of what is viable to solve the problem. Again, I always think of this as an equation or two sides of an equal sign or a seesaw. You can increase the scale of the product to properly address the problem you've decided on, or you can reduce the scale of the problem and make it more narrow. I always use this phrase, embarrassingly narrow. And so again, if you say we want to get people from A to B and we want to get them in style, the answer might be a Ferrari, and the viable product is a Ferrari. But if you say we just want to get people from A to B for one block initially, so you've radically reduced the scale of the problem, you've also reduced the scale of a viable product, in this case, a scooter. And when you're talking about this pancaking, Yaniv and Mona, you both brought this up. What tends to happen is they've got a very big, broad, and poorly defined problem. And there are actually many, many styles, use cases, personas, and what have you.
All over the place.
And so the viability of the product is huge. The surface area to make a quote unquote viable product is huge. And so you've got to get back to this embarrassingly narrow problem, which allows you to build something minimal that is viable to test your hypothesis that there's something there.
Yeah, and I haven't spent a lot of time talking about this, but I think you're absolutely right. The minimum also is poorly understood. And what you're talking about is really if what you have to build is an entire piping of a product, a broad scope, broad space piping of a product thing in order to get the viability going, that's not a startup unless you want to raise 100 million to begin and then take your chances. So the minimum is really important if you're starting a startup because, you've got to be able to have that.
I think something we should coin here, and I don't, maybe someone else has said this and I'm just stealing it. What you need is a minimum viable problem.
That's good.
Right?
There you go.
The first thing you need, once you've imagined and you've noticed this big, hairy, audacious problem with lots of, waste, inefficiency, and pain, you then need to identify a minimum viable problem within that set and then figure out your minimum viable product to address that problem.
Sounds like we've got the title for the podcast. Perfect.
Yes.
Fantastic. Over 7,000 global companies like Atlassian, Dovetail, FlowHealth, and Quora all use Vanta to manage risk and prove security in real time. Why aren't you? Get $1,000 off Vanta when you go to vanta.com/TSP. That's VANTA.com/TSP for the Startup Podcast to get $1,000 off. So Mona, just before we go and sort of talk about the pivot wave, there's one problem here that we weren't going to talk about, but I feel this is the one that I see the most of, which is scaling too soon, right? Which is, to me is a category error of thinking that you're in the scale wave when you're actually still in the launch wave. So can you describe a little bit about how and why that happens and why it's a problem?
It's a problem that I think happens because of the pressure that founders feel to scale quickly. Everybody says it was an overnight success that took 10 years. But, there's just too many startups that invest in scaling too soon because I think they feel perceived or otherwise pressure from their investors to grow faster, pressure from, the environment zeitgeist to grow faster, maybe a little bit of founder self-delusion. They think they're ready when they haven't achieved minimum or they haven't achieved viable or they haven't achieved product market fit. And then to your points earlier, really a lack of understanding about the game they're playing, right? That they don't really know what it takes to play within the space of product market fit. And so I think that that's the why. The how, the latest thing I've been talking a lot about is paradoxes. There's such an interesting paradox between what you have to do when you're in launch and what you have to do when you're in scale. So in launch phase, you're not worried about all the technical debt that you're creating because you're testing and you're repeating and you're changing a lot. And if you fix a bunch of technical debt and then find out that you're going down the wrong path, you've just wasted a lot of time. In this scale wave, you're absolutely worried about the technical debt that you're creating because scaling is all about selling more with the same amount of effort, not selling more with more effort. And so I see a lot of founders, especially, again, the technical founders, who are very worried about making it beautiful and elegant from the very beginning. And that tends to slow them down. I also see a lot of founders who then hire a salesperson early on. And I'm sure you've said this before in previous podcasts, but your first salesperson is your founder. And if they're not closest to the customer, then they actually don't know.
Amen.
They don't know what the customer is saying. And so I think that that's another how you scale too soon. I also think marketing dollars are supposed to be spent early on hypothesis testing also. And most of the time I see marketing dollars spent on trying to get more money in the door at all costs. And I think that that's what you do when you scale, but not when you do when you're launched. So those are like 3 examples that we talk about in the book about scaling too soon.
Those last 2 examples are related to the vaunted undue focus on revenue, which leads to and touches on the thing we talk about almost every episode, which is the technology-backed services company. And you said a phrase in there which I really like. Scaling is about selling more with the same amount of effort. I really, really like that. And it's not just about sales effort, it's about execution or fulfillment effort. So a lot of founders we talk to, Mona, and a lot of founders we see and that listen to this show, they have built these things we call technology-backed services companies where they get any and every person will buy their thing, and then they spend a bunch of time building what they sold instead of selling what they built. And they think they have product market fit. They have thousands, tens of thousands, or millions of dollars coming in the door because they're custom building enterprise stuff for companies. That's not product market fit because of what you just said. It's not selling more with the same amount of effort. And it's focusing on bringing dollars in the door at the early stages instead of bringing in scale. And so that's yet another way that we've talked about this same problem, which is to make sure that you're scaling something with the same amount of effort.
I would also add that you mentioned investor pressure, and we've talked about this before on the podcast. It's very popular on LinkedIn to have the sort of bootstrapping versus VC kind of holy wars. But the truth is, this is not a dichotomy, right? This is not binary. And a lot of it is about timing. I think what happens with scaling too soon is often because founders are actually successful in raising too much too soon, in particular in raising before, to your point, they have product market fit, right? So everyone talks about the rocket ship. Capital is rocket fuel and it's volatile. So once you have rocket fuel, you got to start burning it. And if you've not built the rocket ship first, and that rocket ship is getting to that scale wave to have something that can actually grow explosively with the addition of that fuel, then you're going to waste that rocket fuel, right? It's just going to burn up and it's not going to get you anywhere. And then you're really in a deep hole. And I've fallen for this mistake as well, right? The best practice really is to be very lean and scrappy, have a small team, spend very little money until you hit product market fit, which means also not raising too much. Because once you raise the money, you spend it. That's nearly a physical law, right?
It's a truism. And it's so hard as a leader, as a CEO, as a founder, to say no, because you've hired all these people and they're so excited about doing their thing. That's why you hired them. They're so invested, their mission, and they all start telling you, well, we've got $10 million in the bank. We've got $20 million in the bank. So now I want to do these marketing campaigns. And, I've got this great idea about, developing this AI technology and I want to hire 20 more people. And as a CEO, it's very hard just to say, no, I've got the money in the bank, but I'm not going to spend it on you. But somehow grow fast.
Well, that's right. And you've got the investors saying grow fast. And so you throw money at the problem and you can create the illusion of growth, right? That's why people often talk about churn, right? It's not that hard to add revenue or to add users at the top of the funnel if you spend lots of money. The problem is actually keeping them because if your product's not actually useful, in other words, if you don't have that product market fit, they will churn out. And at some point, your growth is going to flatten out and then even start to get negative, right? And then you're in all sorts of trouble because you've spent a lot of money, you've got a lot of staff, your costs are high, your burn is high, and you've realized that you still don't have product market fit. And you really need to go backwards. It's a very painful process to go backwards in your evolution and say, oh, we need to pivot, right? We need to throw everything out and start again.
All of those metrics are also lagging indicators, which are a big problem,
Exactly.
right? Because you've already spent the money. Yeah.
Let's talk briefly about the pivot wave. So I suppose, I'd be interested in your definition, but I guess a pivot is generally something that happens when you have fallen in love, we talked about not falling in love with the solution, but when you've done a bunch of testing and you've got a result where you say, okay, the problem that I was focusing on or the form of the solution I was focusing on is not working. I need to try something else, something significantly different. Is that how you sort of see the pivot wave?
Yeah, it's you can sort of tell when you need to pivot because you've got a problem. We talked about this earlier, but it's really not looking like you can build a big business out of it in the future. You can't find a path to get there. Or you're just adding more and more and more features, trying to find a path to something that's going to stick and be sticky. And we talk about adding more features, but you're getting less and less focus as you do that. There's many different reasons. You might even need to pivot just a business model, and that might be the way that you have to move from here to there. But in any case, what it sounds like, it's, when there's lots of little pivots, but those are actually just hypothesis testing activities. A real pivot, I like talking about it from the perspective of an employee at the company, is when the leadership comes out and the CEO comes out and says, this is our new strategy. This is our new strategic direction going forward, right? That's when you know that a real pivot is underway.
It's dramatic enough, significant enough that you need to communicate it internally as a pivot.
That's right.
Just again, a little caveat here, a landmine. We've talked about this in recent episodes in the back catalog, so go check it out. Oftentimes, Mona, people will underestimate the scale of a pivot. They might announce it, they might fail to announce it, but they'll fail to review the entire business top to bottom, because often a good pivot requires rethinking all of the aspects of the business. Actually, I think the last episode we published, if I'm not mistaken, with Pablo on the Product Market Fit podcast, talks about what it means to truly pivot. So have a listen to that.
And I think, Mona, those are some of the mistakes that you actually mentioned in the book in the pivot wave, is not pivoting hard enough, exactly to Chris's point.
Absolutely. We talk about in the book not going all in. And that sounds very similar to what you're talking about, Chris, and maybe what you talked about in your last podcast. But you can't do half a pivot. If you're going to get up in front of the company and say, this is our strategic direction now, you've got to think about how it affects every aspect of the company. Oftentimes, if you're a technically focused founder, you might think about a pivot as a technical solution. If you're a sales focused founder, you might think of a pivot as a customer focused or a sales focused solution. But if you're actually the CEO of a company, you have to think about it in terms of every single team that is in your company.
I love that. That's a new little bit of interesting information that I really like, which is if you are a sales-minded founder, you are likely to think of a pivot as a sales problem. And if you're a technical founder, you're likely to think of a pivot as a technical change. And if you're a product founder, you're likely to think of it as a product change, and so on. I really like that. You're likely to think, what we're saying here is when you pivot, most founders leave some aspect of the business unpivoted for too long. They don't pivot hard enough to realign everything, all aspects of the business with the pivot. And what you're saying, Mona, which I love, is that the part you're likely to pivot is the part you know well, and the part you're likely to leave behind is the part you know the least well. That's a really great way of being self-aware. I love it.
So one of the mistakes that you wanted to highlight in the pivot wave, Mona, which I think is an interesting one, is doing the right thing when you get false commitments from customers.
Yeah. So, I think everybody does focus on the execution of a pivot. And the part that we talk about in the book about false commitment actually isn't from customers. It's from your internal team. One of the things that I've seen so many times is that we focus on how we're going to execute the pivot, but we don't think about how we're going to bring the team along so that they execute the pivot with us. And I think the easiest way to think about this, I always like flipping the script when I think about the problem statements we're trying to solve for. So the easiest way to think about this is to think about it from, again, not from the leader's perspective, because we're often trying to give advice to the founders and to the CEOs, but to think about it from an employee perspective. Most of us have been employees at one point or another at a company where the company has declared a strategy one year only to declare a completely different strategy the next year. And we all know how it makes us feel as employees, right? So we're told to go and get deeply invested in that previous direction, and we feel emotionally tied to it and put all our professional effort into it because leadership told us it was so important. And now we're being asked to, in our minds, abandon what we're told to embrace and then believe leadership when they tell us to champion this new direction. And, we all know what we do. We gossip with each other about how management doesn't know what they're doing. We say, some of us, I've heard this so many times, this too shall pass. I'll just keep doing what I'm doing until the next strategy comes along. Other people just get a little disengaged. They start working a little bit less hard. It's no longer a mission, it's a job. Now put your founder CEO hat back on and realize that information doesn't flow uphill, right? Mm-hmm. Employees don't roll their eyes at the CEO. Employees don't roll their eyes at the founder. They do it to each other. So you have to realize that when you're coming to a group of people who have really worked very, very hard on strategy number one, and then you're telling them that you've got to move to strategy number two, that you need to bring them along. And if you fail to bring them along and you just focus on execution, we call it as ignoring false commitment. They're all saying yes, but they really don't feel yes.
One of the things I see, because I've certainly observed this myself, maybe even been guilty of it myself, is that the founder shows too much confidence in every strategy. And this comes back to what we were talking about before, right? Which is, if everything is a hypothesis, we haven't fallen in love with solutions, we haven't fallen in love with problems, it's all about strong opinions loosely held, then a pivot shouldn't come as a surprise to employees. But what a lot of founders do in their internal communications is they project this strong confidence in the correctness of what's being done, right? So what happens is you're like, we're all in on this. This is going to be amazing. It's going to work. Hallelujah. And then you come in and say, actually, we're not doing that anymore. We're doing this. But this new thing, this is definitely going to work. It's going to be amazing. Hallelujah. And people get this whiplash where they're like, you stop believing the founder because they are basically making overly strong promises, right? Or instead of saying, hey, we've tried this thing, it didn't work. Now we're going to try that thing. This is why we think it's a good idea to try. It also may not work. It's like, okay, we were all in on that. Now we're all in on this. And people just stop believing.
It's very much, I think, a product of, again, this Silicon Valley investment mentality where when you go and you pitch to an investor, you have to 100% believe it is not like a strong commitment loosely held. It's a strong commitment strongly held. And so we have this perspective that we have to be confident and positive and 100% sure all the time when we know we're not. And I think the best founders are probably the second or third time founders who are confident enough to say that the whole essence of a startup is that things change. And I need people who are willing to continue changing.
So this is, I think, also a hangover from people not knowing the game they're playing. So when you're in traditional business, legacy business, and traditional industries, it's all about this fake confidence, this bravado. It's the using the royal we. It's talking about innovation and talking about all this sort of stuff. In startup land, A, it's actually slightly more casual, or a lot more casual in Silicon Valley. And B, it's, I think, actually, even in a lot of VC meetings, good VCs with good founders, there's actually a lot less bravado than you might imagine. I think there's a real appetite for curious founders, founders who are clear-eyed about what they don't really know, who are clear-eyed about how they're going to go get more information. I mean, if you look, I think, at Sam Altman, he is the quintessential kind of founder archetype in the sense that he speaks in actually very soft-spoken, curious, measured tones in a lot of ways. Some of what he's saying sounds, fantastical and science fiction, but he still says it in understated and curious and, in some cases, equivocating ways. And so I think even in VC pitches and even when talking to your team, it's not about thumping your chest and acting like you know everything. It's about having the right level of confidence and curiosity and ability to adapt. Threading that needle, that line, can often be a difficult stylistic trick, but more than style, it should be actually how you think about the world, where you have good confidence, strong opinions, but they're loosely held and you're open to new information.
I would maybe contrast, and obviously Sam Altman has done incredibly well, and I don't have an inside perspective on what's going on over there. But I will say that they have changed their strategy over at OpenAI a couple of times, and you've seen massive exodus from the company. And I just wonder whether, despite his approach, he's still got a lot of false commitment. And, there's a lot of execution without bringing the team along.
So you can actually see his evolution in public, right? He talks about, at the beginning he was talking about AGI and what it'll look like, and he talks about these other things and what it'll look like. And there has been a lot of evolution in how he thinks about it, even in his public statements. I don't perceive any of his public statements to have ever been very definitive at all. He's like, the way I'm currently thinking about it, my instinct is, our sense is right now that, and he talks about it in quite humble ways. I think in the case of the exodus of the staff, I think when you're doing a pivot, you have to be comfortable with the fact that some people signed up for one mission and they may not be happy with the pivot, irrespective of how gently and fully you bring them along on this journey, right? And so when you have a bunch of, academics or researchers who are brought into a pure research effort, and you are trying to evolve their thinking to a very commercial, product-centric effort, I don't think the very best engineer whisperers, horse whisperers, founder whisperers are gonna be able to crack the code on that. And so I'm not saying nothing insane is going over there. I'm not saying that. There may be a real deep toxicity and bad management, but also it's not out of the realm of possibility that you can't bring certain people along on seriously hard pivots.
100%. This reminds me of another founder that I was working with for a very short period of time. The reason might become clear, but they had just raised a huge Series B round. looking to hire a huge amount of people very quickly, which goes back to Yaniv, your point of, oh, I've got a bunch of money, I must spend it all at once. I was asking about his existing team, and he said, I'm really proud because for the last 8 years, we've only had one person who has left the company. And I try and keep everybody on the company. And I'm like, no, no, no. Sometimes you need to take them off of the ship and put them in a lifeboat and let them, you got to give them a lifeboat. But that's part of growing up as a company.
We talked about being all in on a pivot in the episode with Pablo. We talked about pivoting hard. That includes changing your team out. It really does. Everything from vision to business model to product marketing to pricing to go-to-market strategy to the people on the team. I think in Sam Altman's case, putting aside any inside toxicity, bad management, whatever, I think it's fully to be expected that you'd see people abandoning the ship.
You have to have a serious element of urgency if you're going to pivot. You can't pivot over a period of 2 years. It's just exhausting and too long. One of the stories in the book is talking about Jensen Huang and NVIDIA. They sound like the most successful company in the world right now, but I love listening to his podcast where he talks about how they nearly died 3 times. The first time they were pivoting, they were trying to create 3D graphic chips, and the market just wasn't buying it up. They were running out of money, and so they had to do it the first time and get it right. Otherwise, they literally were going to die as a company, which is shocking when you think about where NVIDIA is now. His own leadership team, forget about the rest of the company, was just saying like, well, I'm not sure. How are we going to do this one tape out and make it perfect? Because if we don't do it perfectly this time, we die. And they were clearly not very convinced. There was potentially false commitment there. And he said, well, it's going to be perfect because it's the one shot we have. And so I'm going to get invested in making sure it's perfect. And I'm spending 24 hours a day involved in it myself, which is what he did. They taped it out perfectly the first time, and they survived and grew and thrived.
So now, I guess, you've done all of the hard work, the launching, the pivoting, the launching and pivoting. You've actually got product market fit. You're on the exciting bit of that hockey stick curve when it's starting to inflect upwards. You are now in the scale wave. And this is where, Mona, I like to talk about snatching defeat from the jaws of victory, right? Where everything is lined up for you to go well, but you can still kill your own success actually very easily because you now have a fundamentally different business. And if you don't adjust to that, you're in trouble. So what are some of the top mistakes you see here in that scale wave?
The book talks about 5 mistakes, but I would put them into 2 categories. So there's the first category of mistakes is like failing to make the changes from moving from startup to scale up. So those include things like our first 2 mistakes, staying in firefighting mode. We can talk a little bit about that, and continuing to manage like a startup founder. That's the second of that category. And then the other mistakes are more around failing to grow your customer base in a way that is scale. Back to what we said before, grow your customer base without adding too much more effort in the process of growing that customer base. And those are things like approaching partnerships wrong, approaching sort of the customer journey or not approaching the customer journey. I have a big belief that companies underinvest in creating their own communities to help the communities drive more scale. That is more of a growth problem. The first one is more of a you're not changing how you do things problem.
Let's stay with that first category because I think it's something that it's very personal for founders, right? Because one of the things, like we've been saying, it's a different stage of the business. We were just talking and pivoting, Mona, about how sometimes you need to get rid of some of your team, or sorry, that sounds harsh. Like just swap out some of your team, put people in lifeboats, right? This is the stage where, as a founder, CEO especially, you need to do a lot of growing lest you yourself be put in a lifeboat, right? Because you said managing like a startup founder and not adjusting to the needs of a larger company. Yes, your title hasn't changed. You're still founder, you're still CEO, but your role has changed completely. And you need to be able to make that transition so that your company can make that transition into high growth.
We've actually done at least 1, maybe 2 episodes on this, right, Yaniv? Very early episodes around scaling up. And the other is an episode, I think it's titled something like the changing role of the CEO. So be sure to go check those out. We'll try to have them in the show notes for you as well.
Yeah, I talk a lot about trying to have a mindset for founders where they want to actually fire themselves as the founder and then apply to rehire themselves as a CEO of a scale up. Nothing changes in, the real world, but mindset wise, think about what you'd have to do to apply for that CEO role because it's very different from the founder role. And that helps. If you are coming in as a new CEO, and oftentimes founders are replaced with new CEOs, the first thing they tend to do is look at the team and decide if this is the team that they want to go forward with. So even though you're attached to that team, they're the ones who helped bring you to this point. And, you've gone through a lot of wars together and you feel very close to them. It's very hard, but important that as you're scaling up, you think about who is adaptable enough to change into scale up mode and who is not. And, one of the things we talk about in the book, which I've seen happen a few times, so very personal to me, is we talk about old guard versus new guard. So when you're in startup mode, people tend to do a lot of things, right? Because you can't hire a full-time content marketing person and a full-time product marketing person and all of these different things. So you get to play in a lot of areas and you attract a certain kind of personality that loves doing many things. When you get to scale up mode, you need experts that do very specific things incredibly well. And those people who love doing many things might not appreciate the fact that what they perceive as their job responsibilities have been narrowed. And if they can't make that change, then they are startup people. Fantastic. Introduce them to a new startup and give them the best references you can, but they are not scale up people. And I think that that's one example of a mindset shift that a CEO has to make.
There's so much there that I really love, Mona. I literally wrote a blog post a long time ago called Old Guard versus New Guard. The first time I encountered this phenomenon at a startup, it was in my engineering team. But I also really like this idea of firing yourself and then reapplying for that job of CEO. Because you mentioned in passing, the previous generation of VCs, what they used to do routinely is replace the founder as CEO at scale-up stage. I think that orthodoxy has changed. There's been a bit of a cult of the founder, I think, with some amount of validity to it, which is, the best companies tend to remain founder-led. But we've sort of thrown the baby out with the bathwater sometimes, which is in failing to recognize that while retaining the same person, retaining the founder as a CEO is valuable, they have to undergo a massive personal transition, right? They're a caterpillar, they need to turn into a butterfly. And if they don't know that, if they are not forced to reckon with that, then you end up with all of these snatching defeat from the jaws of victory type mistakes at the scale wave, because they're simply not able to scale themselves, their team, their business to meet that product market fit opportunity that they have worked so hard to create for themselves.
I think the most pithy and quotable version of this that we've talked about on the show is that founder CEOs need to move from building the thing to building the thing that builds the thing. And if they want to get really successful, they've got to build the thing that builds the thing that builds the thing. That third layer is working on themselves. So they need to work on their mindset, work on their health, work on their perspectives to help build the company that then build the product and the sales and the growth. And so that, I think very, very good founders make that first leap from working directly on the product to working on the business. The best founders start to work on themselves so they can build a great company that then builds a great product and business.
Brilliant. I 100% agree. Yes. It really is hard, I think, because so many founders have achieved so much success when they get to this point. It's pretty easy to think that you already know everything because you are pretty special at that point.
Yeah, but it's interesting because you know everything about the last wave. You don't know anything about the new wave. And also you know about how to build a startup. You may not necessarily know how to run a business. And we go to great lengths, Yaniv and I, to talk about startups are not businesses. They're learning machines. They're entities that help you create businesses. And then once they transform, like you said, Yaniv, into a butterfly, it's an entirely different beast. And you need to stay on top of that change. All right, well, we've covered the launch wave, the pivot wave, and the scale wave. There is one last wave, the exit wave, but we're going to save that one for another episode because we're planning a whole episode about M&A and exits. We'll try to get Mona back on the show, and we'll also have an M&A lawyer on the show. I'm going to go really deep on that one. So stay tuned for that. Subscribe on YouTube, on your favorite podcasting app, and we'll come back and cover that topic another day.
Mona, this has been an absolutely fantastic discussion. I think your years of experience in working in scale-ups with startups really come through in the book, in your discussions of all these different mistakes. And I'm passionate, I know, Chris, you're passionate too, about helping founders avoid these sorts of mistakes. And so it's wonderful to find a kindred spirit in that. So if people would like to learn more, read your book, maybe work with you, where's the best place to find you and where's the best place for them to buy your book?
Absolutely. I'm on LinkedIn all the time. So just DM me on LinkedIn, Mona Sabet. And our book is on Amazon, bestsellers list. So reach out to Amazon, Sale to Scale.
So just to be clear, we've only done a bit of a hop, skip, and a jump through the book and through some of the topics you cover. So you guys got to really go way deeper on this and find the book. So Sale to Scale.
There are 18 mistakes in the book. Each one's a chapter, and I would have loved to discuss all of them, but then this would have been a Lex Friedman style 5-hour podcast. And who's got time for that? So, but yeah, strongly recommend. It's a fantastic read. And yeah, Sale to Scale, Mona Sabet. So thanks so much again for coming on. Have a good one.
It's been fantastic. Thanks so much.
All right, another great episode, Yaniv. How can people find you on the internet?
I am on LinkedIn trying to make it a less boring place, so I'd love to get connection requests from TSP listeners there. Let me know you're from TSP and I will add you to my network. How about you, Chris?
Yeah, you can find me at chrissaad.com and chrissaad.com/advisory, where you can learn about my work. I help companies avoid many of these dead ends and wasted time and just fast forward to the best answer as quickly as possible. And of course, on all the social media at Chris Saad. Great chatting, Yaniv, as always. Catch you in the next one.
Good to be back. Today's episode of the Startup Podcast was brought to you by Vanta. Vanta automates compliance for SOC 2, ISO 27001, and more, saving you time and money while helping you build customer trust. Plus, you can streamline security reviews by automating questionnaires and demonstrating your security posture with a customer-facing trust center, all powered by Vanta AI. Over 7,000 global companies already use Vanta. Why don't you? Get $1,000 off Vanta when you go to vanta.com/TSP. That's VANTA.com/TSP for the Startup Podcast to get $1,000 off.